Hey everybody, it's Timothy here. I decided I would go ahead and start a new segment here. I've been talking to a lot of newer players, a lot of younger players at my store, and I feel like these videos would be very helpful to them to kind of get through the nuances of Magic. Magic's a really easy game to learn. The basics are simple, but there are a lot of complications, a lot of very kind of hidden rules that you don't really learn about until you get really into the game, and my hope is that I can make a couple videos to clarify some of the things that people may have trouble understanding, or concepts that don't come up in a normal casual game of Magic, concepts that might come up during F&M or on a card that you're reading and you just might not know how to handle it. So this is a new player's handbook to certain Magic rules, and I'll preface this by saying first off that this is intended for newer players. If you are an experienced player, if you're an L2 judge, obviously this is not for you, but I do still appreciate your feedback on whether everything I'm saying is accurate and whether everything I'm saying is actually something useful that new players could use. One of the things that really troubled me, that took me a while to really get an understanding of, even though it's kind of a simple concept once you have it, is the difference between an activated ability and a triggered ability. A lot of times you'll read on cards, target creature can't activate its abilities, or counter target triggered ability, or something like that. Or certain cards will have costs that are very unique. Costs that don't show up on other cards very often, and it may be difficult for a new player to identify at an F&M tournament on the fly when your opponent's waiting for you to do something, whether or not that's an activated or triggered ability. It is worth learning the difference between them. So we're going to start off with this video. This is part 1. I'll be covering only activated abilities in this video. I will be covering triggered abilities in part 2, so be on the lookout for that. And as always, thank you guys for watching, and let me know any feedback you have in the comments below. Make sure to hit that like button too. I just like seeing thumbs ups. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and jump right in. I like to think of an activated ability as a manual ability. That is, you have to actually physically take some sort of action in order for that ability to happen. If you don't manually cause that ability to activate, it's never going to activate. Activated abilities have costs. Sometimes it's just one cost, sometimes it's multiple costs. This often includes things like tapping a permanent, often tapping a creature to use a tap ability, or paying some sort of cost like mana or life, or even things like discarding a card or sacrificing a creature. You'll see all sorts of types of abilities. The most common are usually tap abilities, which uses the tap symbol, or mana abilities. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say mana abilities. That's a different type of ability. But abilities that require you to pay mana as a cost. A very recent example of this, a very common example, are activated abilities on creatures that require you to pay mana. For instance, Quilled Wolf's ability here requires you to pay 5 colorless or 5 generic mana and a green mana. Once you've paid that cost, you activate the ability. Then Quilled Wolf gets +4/+4 until end of turn. If you never activate that cost, if you never manually choose to make that ability happen, it will not happen. It is not a triggered ability. Nothing is causing it to trigger. You'll see in the next video that triggered abilities activate in response to something happening in the game. Activated abilities require you to take action. Pretty simple concept. Some activated abilities have multiple costs. In the case of Quilled Wolf, you have just one cost to pay. That's the 6 total mana you have to pay to activate the cost. The biggest thing I can teach new players about the difference between activated and triggered abilities is that the colon in the card text usually separates the cost from the effect. Anything that is listed before the colon is generally a part of the cost. So you'll see on Quilled Wolf, right here, you have 5 green and the colon. Everything before the colon is part of the cost. Everything after the colon is part of the effect you get once you pay that cost. Look at another example from Shadows over Innistrad, Sinister Concoction. You see a huge cost to activate this card. Everything before the colon at the very bottom of the card is a cost to activate this ability, and yes, it is an activated ability. They can show up on pretty much any card type. There's sorceries and instants with activated abilities, creatures, enchantments, artifacts, everything can have activated abilities. Lands are, you tap lands with an activated ability to make mana. But looking at Sinister Concoction, you actually see that it has 5 different costs. Paying black mana is part of the cost. Paying 1 life is part of the cost. Putting the top card of your library into the graveyard is a cost. Discarding a card is a cost. Sorry, not discarding 2 cards. Discarding 1. And then sacrificing the concoction itself is a cost. Destroy target creature. Those 3 words are the effect you get once you've paid all the other costs. So you see an activated ability requires you to pay the costs first. If you cannot pay those costs, the ability cannot happen. You cannot make the ability happen. If you are not able to do any of these 5 things all together, then you cannot activate the ability to destroy target creature. So if you're at 1 life, you can pay that life and lose the game. If you have no cards in your hand, you cannot physically discard a card, which means you can't activate Sinister Concoction's activated ability. Big question, when can I actually use activated abilities? They're different from triggered abilities. Triggered abilities will just happen whenever they happen. Activated abilities as a manual ability requires you to actually do something on your end. So the question you really need to know is, when can I do that? Unless otherwise stated, you can use an activated ability of a card anytime you could cast an instant. There are lots of exceptions to this rule, but this is a general rule that you can use an activated ability whenever you could cast an instant. Take, for instance, another Shadows over Innistrad card. Discard a card, transform Heir of Falconwrath. Activate this ability only once each turn. The cost here is to discard a card. The effect you get from doing that is to transform Heir of Falconwrath into its flip side. Now, you might be thinking, when can I discard that card? Can I only do it on my turn? Is there time I can do it during my opponent's turn? The question you ask yourself if you're ever wondering when to do this is, could I cast an instant at this time? If you answer yes to that question, if you are able to cast an instant at that time, then you may activate that activated ability. This goes for any sort of cost, whether it's a mana cost, whether it's paying life, whether it's discarding a card, or sacrificing a creature, or what have you. You can do that activated ability anytime you could cast an instant. So if you're ever confused, ask yourself that question. Could I cast an instant at this time? And if you answer yes, then yes, you may activate that ability. Tap abilities on creatures have restrictions. Whenever you see the tap ability, the tap icon on a card, then you may not use that ability if it's on a creature and the creature has Summon and Sickness. Notice that that says creatures only. Lands have activated abilities. Artifacts and enchantments have activated abilities. You can use those right away the turn you play those cards. But if it's a creature, it still has to abide by the rules that it can't use an activated ability if it has Summon and Sickness. The exception here, obviously, is if the creature has haste or it's somehow not affected by Summon and Sickness, then you may use that ability right away. For instance, Lifespring Druid has an actual mana ability. The cost of that card is tapping. The cost of the ability is tapping. You'll notice the tap symbol comes before the colon. Once you tap it, you get 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. But if Lifespring Druid just came into play under your control during the turn you want to use this ability, and it has no way of getting haste, then you cannot use that ability. This is very different from Heir of Falconwrath's ability, which is not a tap ability. Heir of Falconwrath can use the ability right away because it discard effects and life loss effects and things like that are not affected by Summon and Sickness. The tap ability is affected by Summon and Sickness. So keep that in mind. If it's on a creature and it has a tap ability, you cannot use that ability the turn you played that card. It's the same kind of restrictions as attacking. Ask yourself the question, could I attack with this creature this turn? And if you answer no to that question, you probably can't use the activated ability that requires tapping. There are other restrictions on when and if you're able to use an activated ability, but from my experience, these are almost always stated very clearly on the card. It can be a little confusing sometimes, but mostly you'll be able to get what you need from the card. For example, you might look at a card like Reaper of Flight Moonsilver, another Shadows over Innistrad card you might have been playing with recently. You'll see a 3/3 flyer, and it has a Delirium ability that states you may sacrifice another creature and Reaper of Flight Moonsilver gets +2/+1 until end of turn. Now the cost of activating that card is sacrificing a creature. That's a cost. In order to get the +2/+1, you must sacrifice another creature. However, there's an extra line of text at the bottom that says, activate this ability only if there are 4 or more card types among the cards in your graveyard. Delirium ability is a restriction on when and if you can activate a activated ability. Delirium abilities require you to have that condition met in order for you to activate it. So for example, if you do not have Delirium active, if you only have 3 or less card types in your graveyard, you may not activate this ability even if you could sacrifice a creature. It's just not an option. You have to fulfill all requirements in order to activate an ability, and you have to abide by all rules. You'll see on some cards, not very many in Standard right now, but some cards that say your opponent cannot sacrifice creatures in order to activate abilities, or your opponent may not pay life to activate abilities. If an effect like that is targeting you, or an effect like that is on the board, you have to abide by those rules for activating abilities. Moving on, a very, very common question here that doesn't come up a lot in Standard but comes up in other formats is whether or not you can interact with an activated ability. This is going to be a lot similar to triggered abilities because just like triggered abilities, activated abilities do in fact use the stack. Once you've activated an ability, that ability is put on the stack, and it must resolve like any other card would on the stack or any other spell would. A very, very important thing to note here, though, is that the costs do not involve the stack. They're not put on the stack. So, for instance, if a card tells me to sacrifice a creature in order to activate an ability, sacrificing that creature does not use the stack. It's already done and over with once the ability is on the stack. So my opponent cannot interact with the creature I've sacrificed in order to put a card on the stack like that. Take the example of Reaper of Flight Moonsilver that we just saw. Once I've sacrificed that creature to activate the ability, my opponent may not do anything to the creature I sacrificed. It's already gone. The debt has already been paid, so to speak. The ability has already been put on the stack. There is no reversing certain costs for activating certain activated abilities. Certain activated abilities may also be countered. If that's the case, those costs are not refunded. You'll notice some cards require you to pay mana or pay life to activate a cost. If you do that and your activated ability is countered while it's on the stack or it never resolves, you do not get quote-unquote refunded for whatever you paid. You sacrifice a creature and your ability gets countered, too bad, your creature's gone. Take an example, looking at Indulgent Aristocrat. This card has an activated ability which requires you pay 2 mana and sacrifice a creature, and then you put a 1/1 counter on all your vampires. Let's say I want to activate that ability, so I pay 2 mana and I sacrifice a creature. The ability goes on the stack. I'm waiting for it to resolve, but I have to see if my opponent wants to respond. They do respond. They activate a card called Stifle. This is an instant that can counter an activated ability. They respond to my activated ability while it's on the stack by playing a counter spell targeting my activated ability. Assuming there are no other cards played here, nobody else has any effects, Stifle will actually counter the activated ability, but my costs have already been paid. I do not get the creature back. I do not get that mana back. You do not regain any lost costs once you've activated an ability. So be very careful. If your opponent you think can counter your ability, it's not very often that your opponent will be able to counter abilities in draft or standard, but it is a possibility that you need to be aware of. Be very careful of how lenient you are to pay certain costs. Some costs are very exorbitant. Some require you to pay lots of mana or lots of life or sacrifice a bunch of creatures. You do not want to get those abilities countered because once you've sacrificed your board to a very strong spell, if that spell does not resolve, you do not get back the cost of the card. Moving on, a couple special notes that I felt were very important. First off, sometimes you'll see a 0 where an activated ability would be, whenever you see a 0, that essentially means it's free to activate that ability. It doesn't have any other costs unless it says so. You don't have to pay any mana. This is just kind of a shortcut for wizards to say you can activate this ability for free. Sometimes it won't show a 0. It'll have other sorts of effects, but whenever you see 0, that means the only cost to activate that card is basically to announce, I want to activate that card. You don't have to pay any mana or anything special. Also, sometimes you'll see an X in a cost. This lets you choose whatever amount of mana or whatever amount of life or whatever it is that you're paying to pay. You can choose whatever number you want to represent X so long as you can pay that actual cost. But you may actually choose 0 to be X. If your card requires you to pay an X cost, you can physically say, I'll choose to pay 0, and X will simply be substituted for 0. The effect will resolve as if X is treated as 0. A couple examples. We'll see this older card from Scars of Mirrodin, Steel Hellkite. The second ability on it, perhaps I should say the third ability, says X, that's the activation cost, destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost X whose controller was dealt damage by Steel Hellkite this turn. Activate this ability only once each turn. So you see again the restriction at the very end of that card. Now this is interesting. Normally you would want to pay 3, 4, 5 mana, and every time you see X on that card, that's what it represents. If I pay 3 mana, you're essentially reading this card as destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost 3, who's convert blah 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 blah, right? But I can actually choose 0 for X. It is a possibility, and X will simply be treated as 0, so it'll destroy all non-land permanents with a converted mana cost of 0, i.e. tokens and other things like that. Very interesting nuances that a lot of newer players don't know they can do. Here's an example of 0 as an activation card. A recent card from Oath of Gatewatch simply says 0 mana, activate, attach target equipment to this card, activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. So again, a restriction there, but you see how the 0 is just a way to denote that you're activating an ability. If the 0 weren't there and it simply started with attach target equipment, there would be a lot of confusion as to what kind of effect this is, since attaching the equipment to the card is not the cost. It's simply activating the ability that's the cost. The only time this really matters too much is if an opponent has a card that stops you from activating abilities, in which case you simply can't activate this even if the ability is free. Another special note, and this is very prevalent in Shadows over Innistrad, is that some abilities, specifically activated abilities, only work from certain zones, and the card with the activated ability has to be present in that zone in order for the ability to even be activated in the first place. Again, these are usually pretty obvious from the text. You'll notice Torrent Elemental's last ability says you may put it from exile onto the battlefield tapped, activate it only anytime you could cast a sorcery, and you have to pay a mana cost for it. So there is an activation cost, but if Torrent Elemental is not in the exile zone, then this ability essentially doesn't matter. It might as well not exist. If it is the exile zone, then you have the option to use that ability so long as you're doing it as a sorcery. The same goes for cards that activate from the graveyard or the hand, or even a few cases that activate from the library. Nearheath Chaplain is a good example. For 3 mana and exile a Nearheath Chaplain from your graveyard, you can put 2 1/1 white spirit tokens on the battlefield, activate it only as a sorcery. You see this text a lot, activate only as a sorcery. Essentially means you can only do it when the stack's empty, when it's your turn, and only in certain phases of the turn. Interesting note here, you'll notice that the colon comes after exile and Nearheath Chaplain, which means that exile and Nearheath Chaplain is part of the cost. If Nearheath Chaplain is not in your graveyard, you can't activate that cost because you're not able to exile the card from your graveyard. There are tons of different ways activated abilities pop up. You'll see them a lot on creatures. Here I have a bunch of creature examples, but you'll see them all over the place. The thing to watch out for is the colon. That essentially tells you that you have an activated ability on your hands. Planeswalker abilities are, in fact, activated abilities. They do have a cost, and the cost is removing or adding the appropriate number of loyalty counters. So whether you're plus in a Planeswalker or minus in a Planeswalker, or even if you're 0 in a Planeswalker, that is the cost. If a card tells you you can't activate activated abilities, or perhaps an enchantment aura is enchanting your Planeswalker and says that Planeswalker's activated abilities can't be used, you cannot use the loyalty abilities on your Planeswalker. Another thing to note for very, very new players is that Planeswalker abilities can only activate Planeswalker can only activate an ability once per turn, and you can only do this at sorcery speed, so to speak. You can't use an activated ability of a Planeswalker during your opponent's turn. So you'll notice a card like Obnixilis, you may be familiar with this. The cost to destroy a creature with his second ability, it says -3, destroy target creature. The cost is to remove 3 loyalty counters from it. If you don't have 3 loyalty counters, 1 or 2 on Obnixilis, you can't physically activate that ability. You can only activate the +1 ability. Most of the time you can activate plus abilities regardless of the situation because the cost is actually putting a counter on it. You'll notice the minus abilities are the ones that you're sometimes restricted from using. Similar to the last slide, you'll notice that some Planeswalkers have -X or 0 in their abilities. Whenever you see a 0, that means the ability is free, essentially. You do still activate it the same way you see 0 in an activated ability. It just means you're not physically manipulating the loyalty counters on it. You're not plussing or minusing. You're simply saying, I want to activate this ability. It doesn't cost me any loyalty counters. -X abilities let you choose a number, which is pretty intuitive. You just choose what you want X to be, and you say, I'm going to -X. Tell your opponent what X is going to be. Once you do that, remove that number of counters, and then treat the ability with whatever number you chose. Chandra is a great example of this from Oath of the Gatewatch. Has a +1 ability, which obviously you would just put 1 counter on it, but also has a 0 and a -X ability. If I wanted to use her second ability for the turn, I would simply say I'm going to activate Chandra's 0 ability, and then I would do what the card tells me to do. Or if I wanted to activate her third ability, I would tell my opponent I'm going to use Chandra's third ability. I would specify the amount for X, and I would remove that number of counters from Chandra. Very, very intuitive stuff, but things that newer players may not be aware of all the time. So that's what I've got for you on activated abilities. The thing to keep in mind, the thing that really helps me clear it up, is that an activated ability is a manual ability. If you don't go out of your way to make that ability happen, if you don't pay the activation costs, it's never going to happen. Keep that in mind. Keep that in mind, especially when I start talking about triggered abilities in the next video. And you can actually help me out by giving me feedback on this video. Tell me, was it helpful for you? Was it interesting at all? Maybe my voice is kind of, I don't know, a little bit this one. Anyway, was anything incorrect? Was anything misleading? This is especially for new experienced players who are watching the videos. Did I say something that might lead a player to think the wrong thing, or did I say something that was just blatantly wrong? Also, for newer players, what subjects do you struggle with? What would you like me to cover in a video, or what would you just like clarification on? Remember that the next video is going to be on triggered abilities, and if you like this video, I suggest you like that video as well. I'll be making it very soon, so be on the lookout for it. And as always, like, comment, and subscribe. I really appreciate the comments, I appreciate the feedback, and I appreciate engaging in conversation with the Magic community. So any comments you leave, I'll do my best to respond to them. And any feedback, please be constructive about it, but I'll do my best to incorporate it into my videos. At any rate, like, comment, subscribe. I will see you guys next time, and be on the lookout for part 2 soon. Thank you, and have a good night.